No, I'm not.
There we go.
All right,
That's good.
that's better. And it just froze that. There we go. I'm just going to use the buttons.
This
That
works
works
to
now?
do that, yeah.
Okay.
Kind of a weird thing.
Another way to think about this, and this is not mine, this is courtesy of a gentleman by the name of Paul Anderson, is to think of learning like a lock. And you can see this kind of orange box in the middle. That's our phenomenon. That's something we're trying to explain, which is what our content is in essence. This thing that we're trying to explain is our content. And we want to unlock that content. And the way we do that is using our cross-cutting concepts and our practices. So students actively use those items to unlock their learning. We have a bunch of shifts that are supposed to happen in order to do that hard work, to actively get into those 3 dimensions and move our students into doing science, not just learning the history of science. We've learned through this research that we're graduating students who are really good at spitting back science facts, the history of science, everything that's ever went right in science, they can tell you all about it. They get into fields or even graduate school where they're asked to be scientists and they can't do it. And one of 2 things happens. There's an attrition and they just leave, go find another job, or they stay in it and they hate it because it's not really what they thought they were going to do. Okay, so we want to teach people to be scientists, and not just the people that are going to go into science, but I think we can all agree that a way of thinking as a scientist is probably beneficial to our society in general. Some of the things that you see in these shifts are just good teaching. It's not just related to science, but a lot of this is just good teaching. We're not going to do just rote memorization of facts. The facts and terminology will come in when needed, when students are ready for it. The teacher isn't just going to sit here like I am today and provide information to the whole class. The students are going to get the information through investigations, through solving problems, through obtaining their own information from outside sources and bringing it to the table so that the group, the learning community, can then solve that problem, right? So all of these things are just really good teaching. This is kind of my favorite at the bottom, worksheets. We're gonna do less worksheets. In terms of New York State, we have new science standards. They were adopted December of 2016. Unfortunately, there's this big event that we've all been living through that has sort of pushed our implementation timeline back just a little bit. But nonetheless, our new science assessments are going to come out September of the school year of 2023. So they're getting closer. So for everybody that's sort of been going, I'll wait till they get here, I'll wait till they get here, they're kind of knocking on the door at this point. So we need to start getting ready. Even though we've pushed back those dates twice now due to the pandemic, they're still knocking on our door. And according to this timeline, our elementary and our middle schools should already be implementing the new standards. Those teachers should be teaching their students based on these standards. I always start when I do an assessment workshop with this picture. And a lot of people laugh. Teachers usually kind of groan a little bit. I show that timeline about when the exams are happening because some people need to be spurred in the right direction with that timeline. But I think this is where we really need to talk. That timeline shouldn't matter to us. Our state assessments are nothing but an autopsy. They tell us how our students did after they've left our room, right, in science. They take the Regents exam in biology and they go on to earth science or they go on to chemistry. I never see those students again. Middle school, they take that science assessment and they go to high school and those conversations never happen about how did that student score? What were those students' strengths? It really is an autopsy. And I've lived through data days in my district where we sit with our Regents scores. And the only thing it helps me do is make my program better. It doesn't help me teach students in front of me right now. It doesn't tell me their strengths, their weaknesses. What do I need to work on? So my argument when I do assessment workshops is let's not focus on that last test. Let's focus on the students we have in front of us. Let's be diagnosticians not performing autopsies. So that means that our assessments and our lessons should align. And when we do frequent assessments in our own classroom, that should inform our instruction. That's how we know where our students are at. That's how we know how to move them forward. And are they approaching the end target, which is that state exam in the end? So to that end, this is really important in science. We should be doing tasks that frequently ask students to perform in a similar way to how they should perform on that Regents exam. And so these are called embedded performance assessments. We can think of these as very short. This is not a 3-hour Regents exam. It's not even, a couple day test. It's short. We're going to give these at the end of the lesson sequence. We're going to use a new phenomenon. We're not asking them to tell me everything you learned about the phenomenon we just unlocked. I want you to apply what you learned in this phenomenon to a new situation. We'd like it to be as authentic as possible. We want them to be 3-dimensional practices, cross-cutting concepts, content, and we want them to be rigorous. This shouldn't be a cheesecake for them. It should be a good evaluation of what you can do. So I have a screening tool that, again, not mine, although I did help make it, that helps teachers when they look at things that are out there on the web, decide, is this a good assessment? Is this something I should be using as one of these short performance assessments for my students? And to get everybody sort of into this, I thought that we could screen a couple of things together. So Dave, I have the lesson screener. I'll switch back to this one for my online folks, if there is anybody. And we're not going to do a full whole hog screen. We're just going to do a kind of a little cursory screen along the way. They'll also need, might as well just get. We're going to do one together first, and then I have one for you to look at sort of on your own, just to kind of get practice with this. I think this is a very important step for teachers to start screening what's out there. Why? Because we should be educated consumers, and we should know what our target is. Thank you, Dr. Henry. So you can kind of ignore the front of the screening tool. I'm going to walk through the back of the screening tool with you. So we first need to sort of agree on a phenomenon, what that definition is in the science world. And it's an observable event. So literally something that you could see day in and day out. It doesn't have to be phenomenal, right? It's just an observe. Yes. It helps if it is phenomenal, but it can be just an everyday event. So we're going to start. Does this assessment contain a phenomenon, something observable in everyday life? Now, for those of you, we've got a magnet and we've got compass needles on the bottom. Observable event?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Maybe not in your everyday life, but you've got some Boy Scouts in the room, perhaps Girl Scouts have said, oh yes, I've seen that. We do some orienteering classes, right? We have to look for a practice. That's kind of our next step. So we look for what the science and engineering practices are. I know that based on our FIST to 5, that's not something that you guys are going to be able to do right now. The practices are a performance, right? So when I see words like explain, in my mind, it can be one of the practices, which is to provide an explanation. It might not be. So we'll put that one like maybe there's a practice there. We'd have to really dig into it and see maybe. The stimuli have multiple and sufficient information needed to utilize the SCP. In other words, there's multiple data sets.
No.
No, I don't see multiple data sets. I literally see a picture here. Okay. Are we getting at content? Well, yeah, magnet. So we'll give it content. Are we getting at a cross-cutting concept? A big picture idea? Partially? What do you think, Dr. Henry? I say partially on this one. I don't see it explicitly stated.
I would say yes, but that's the physicist.
That's the physicist in you, I know. All right. Graphic organizers, yeah, there's lines. I mean, it is. We're doing an explanation, so lines help. Contains information that is accurate, sure. They point in the direction of explaining the phenomenon, sure. It's authentic, yeah. It's a magnet and a compass. It's pretty authentic to me. Is novel to show the transfer of knowledge. We don't know that. We don't know what the teacher taught, so I can't answer that novel. If I was picking this for my classroom, I could answer that. Is this something I didn't do? It's a new situation. But at this point, I can't really tell. So this sort of screens okay. Right. Now, here's where the breakdown begins to happen. One of your sheets is a progression. And I'm going to say, let's pull that one that is models, developing and using models. As you look at that develop and using model sheet, you can see our grade bands across the top, K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. Let's agree that this is around being able to use this model. They're giving us this thing that's happening in a way, and you have to figure out what's going on for the sake of this being easy for people here. I'd like you to look at what they're asking students to do at each grade band and see if you could find a grade band that this might fit in. So they're given this model, they're going to use it then to provide their explanation.
So we're using the one that's on page 19.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a little piece on the back. I didn't see that.
Yep. Dr. Henry, do you see a lot of verbs in the grade bands?
I see a lot of verbs in the grade band.
What are the verbs that you see?
Identify, evaluate, develop, collaboratively develop.
I see a lot of develop. Yes. I see evaluate, right? Do we see use very often in the upper grade levels? Not very often. We have develop, revise, and use. The or is kind of there, right? But we don't see just plain use. So if I were to really screen this now, I have to look at the grade bands. Is it really appropriate? This is a middle school question right now currently. And so when I look at the progressions, I see that I'm probably really not working in a middle school level. Being able to just use that model, right, to describe a scientific principle or design solution is in the 3 to 5 range. So it's in my K to 5 band. And so although I might see questions and say, oh, I can still use this because I still have magnets in my curriculum, this may not be a good thing to use because I'm working at a lower level than I should. So some aha moments that come out of this is, ooh, I have to know what grade level I'm working at. I know that sounds obvious, but that's one of our biggest hurdles in science because we know what we should be doing. But then when we really dig into it, we realize we're not working at the level we want to work at. The really interesting layer of this is everybody that says, I want to wait and see what the exams are going to look like. I might have to jump a couple grade bands in what I'm currently doing to get my students ready for the types of questions that they're going to see. So to that end, let's look at a good middle school question. I did put, if I move me out of the way here, I did put a QR code. You have a copy, Dave, yes? Do they have copies of that?
Yep.
All right, you have a copy of the sample task. Those of you online, you have a QR code that you can get to it. But I'd like you to just compare at this point. Take a look. How is this different from the one that you just looked at? It was a cluster of a couple questions using a diagram. It looks kind of cursory, the same as I'm looking at it here. What are some unique differences that you notice? And I'll pull that one back up.
First of all, there's context. Which makes it more of a real phenomenon.
It's situational. It's a story.
The creating, are you asking us?
Yeah, go ahead. As you notice something, feel free to share.
Creating a new way instead of just.
They're developing a model. Did we see that we're developing a lot? Yeah.
Far more interesting. I would want to look at this.
Which is an awesome observation, because if we're going to be doing these frequent, short, embedded performance tasks, you want them to be interesting. You don't want kids to roll their eyes and go, oh God, it's NWEA days again, or it's, Smart Start days again. You want them to learn something new from the short performance assessment. And so an interesting story that's a unique phenomenon, even though they're applying their learning to it, still affords an opportunity for students to learn something new.
I like on the back how it says how you change your experience.
So we're evaluating ourselves, right? We're looking at what we did or what somebody else did, and then thinking about how we could do that better, or problems in theirs that we didn't think of. There's multiple practices in here. Again, fist of five, I wouldn't expect that to come out, but there's multiple things students are being asked to do in there. They're thinking about investigations, which is a practice. They're developing their models, which is a practice. They're doing some computational thinking, which is a different practice. So there's multiple practices kind of coinciding in that one assessment. Exita.
The way that it's worded, I feel like if I were doing this, I would scientist, because bar, this is the scenario, how would you, so it has a different flavor.
Yeah. I'm actively problem solving this, where this is like spitting out what should be in my brain. I have to know what the picture is, but once oh, that's a magnet, I just kind of spit out what I should have learned. Where this is, you are in the position of a scientist. I think those are great observations. So this is a big thing to think about now as we move forward, because if I go back and say, I have this lesson and assessment alignment, how do I begin to change my instruction to align with those types of assessments? No longer is it, I'm just going to spit back what's in my head. I have to constantly put my students in the position of being a scientist, which means my lesson structure has to change. So what is our goal when we do these frequent embedded performance assessments? Well, first of all, a good science classroom, getting all three dimensions in, being culturally responsive, using social emotional learning, putting my students in the guise of being a scientist is a complex system of interaction. We're going to have a lot of teacher-student interaction, but we're also going to have a lot of student-student interaction in good instruction. We have to intertwine those 3 dimensions in order to have good instruction. I can't just rely on what the end exam is going to look like to really fully assess that complex interaction that should be happening in my room. So the goal is to give me information and baby steps along the way. I can make inferences about what my students know and adjust as we move forward. To that end, New York State Ed has partnered with several other state education partners to create what they're calling SIPs. It's a very long name. Stackable, instructionally embedded, portable science assessments. So there is now a conglomerate of states working towards creating what you were just looking at, these little short performance assessments. Some states are using them throughout the year as their formal state assessment. New York State has chosen not to do that. These will be used curricularly if you so choose to use them. But they're coming, which is great because it also provides us as educators some common tasks that we can then get together, collaborate on how our students are doing and what our best practices when we see gaps in what the students are able to do. Yes, Julia.
Are the SIPs K-12 or are they high school?
That's a good question. My understanding is that they wanted them to be K-12 so that the thought was that if we have these things for every grade level, if a teacher really didn't know what to do, you have an example.
Right.
Because state ed has said numerous times they're not in the curriculum business. So this is their way around being in the curriculum business. If I provide you these sort of step-by-step assessments along the way, you could think about what you'd have to do to get your kids through that. This is really just, in our state, going to be teacher resource material. It's not going to be used in any other way, shape, or form. It's just available for us to use with our students.
Do you think elementary teachers could use them instead of just like an assessment, they could use them as instructional?
That's the goal, right? So what can districts do to get ready? Well, every science assessment is still created by New York State teachers. We are the only discipline that still creates our own Regents tests and intermediate and elementary exams. We are not outsourced yet. Right. I have seen the rubric for each item, and it is a rigorous rubric. The item will not get through to the next level if it's not 3-dimensional. So the first thing that districts can do is start unpacking what those 3 dimensions are. But no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Get familiar with what's happening. Pay very close attention to those progressions that I gave you. What grade band are we actually working at? Yes, you might have this awesome curriculum that's really been working for you, but if the kids are not working at the level that they should be, how are you going to up the ante so that they are working at the correct grade band? If you need to, how are you going to change your instruction? How are you going to put students in that world of being a scientist day in and day out? For my elementary and my middle school teachers, they need to become familiar with the PLDs, the performance level descriptors. They are not out for high school yet, but they are out K-8. So our performance level descriptors basically say, here's, if we had this question, we had an item, what does the student do that would put them on a level? Level 3 will always be the performance expectation from the standards. Level 4 is above and beyond. So if your students are consistently performing at a level 3, they are meeting the standards. 4 is above that. And so as I've been talking to elementary and middle school teachers, I said it's really important for you to look at this because sometimes it's a whole nother practice. Right? And you've never worked with that in this particular context. So you may want to add that for your students that are capable of doing that. Or it might be use a model, use a model, use a model, but the level 4 is to develop a model. And if you've never had your students develop a model, they're never going to reach level 4. And you have to be okay with that. You didn't do that. You focused on the standard. So I think the performance level descriptors help give teachers a good picture of the range of output that students might get. Julie?
And I'm sorry, did you say this was a New York State thing? or
This is New York State. This is New York State. They are out for elementary and for middle school. So every grade level has these, K to 8. So very important thing for teachers to begin unpacking. It's a great place to start. Here's my standard, so I can look up that standard and then I can look at what they're doing.
There's, I'll just say there's, because the standards are based on the next generation standards, which are national.
Right.
There are many tools. So that was New York, but there's all kinds of
There's
things
things out
going
there.
on, both
National.
nationally and by state. And there's other deeper level things that people don't get into, just evidence statements, which unpacks the standard. A lot of teachers don't even know those exist. So if you just combine that with the evidence statement, you've taken a little standard like this and made it
Much broader.
much broader and understandable.
Right. Yeah. And this is helpful from an assessment standpoint. You know, if you are the teacher that is really worried about what those assessments are going to look like, you know, you're going to pull the SIPs and use the SIPs in your classroom. Somebody else created those, but you still want to know what is that final New York State assessment going to look like? This helps you kind of gauge your students. Where are they working?
And how many standards were included in elementary grade? Yeah.
There's some grades have 6 to 8. High school, it's a little more than that. When I divvy them up, the bulk are bio and earth science, and then they split the physical science into 2, so they have their
So
a little less,
the state has separated them into kind of groups,
right?
and each grade level might have 3 or 4 groups. You could think of a group as something you could do in a unit.
Mhm.
It's not quite how we want to think, but it helps answer that question.
And then depending on the grade, like kindergarten, there's 2 in each, right? It's 3 groups, a couple here, a couple there, done. As you get older, we add a few more because they're doing science a little, or should be doing science a little bit more often. Another big suggestion is just to begin using phenomena. I'm not going to read about this. We're not going to do some little hokey investigation. We're going to look at a phenomenon and plan an investigation to figure out what's going on in the phenomenon. That one little switch puts your students in that position of being a scientist. When you do tests or assessments, create clusters of questions like you saw in the one that I gave you. Use multiple practices. Try to get at a phenomenon in multiple ways and allow your students to be in that position. Whenever possible, open up the science practices and use it. Right? Pick one and use it and make sure you're using them all. Don't just use the obtain information because you're saying, well, they're reading, so they're obtaining information. Make them do an investigation, make them develop a model, make them ask questions. And think of it like that lock. Use those practices to help students unlock the content that they should know. This is hard work. It's not easy. As I said before, it's this very complex system that's happening in a science classroom. And the best thing to do is to attend PD whenever you can. I also suggest you need to check the New York State website as often as you can, mainly because updates happen and you don't want to miss the update, especially on the timeline. Or if the high school PLDs come out, we want to see those because that opens up some conversations. And sometimes it doesn't filter out from superintendents to principals to teachers. And so being on the list and checking frequently is very helpful. Just an update for my elementary and my intermediate people. Currently, we give the exam in 4th grade. There's a written piece and a performance piece. The exam is now going to be in 5th grade. Okay. 8th grade, written piece, performance piece. But there's a change in that performance component. Districts have in the past had a window. You have to give the performance during these 3 days in April, right? These 3 days in May. There's no longer going to be an administration window. There's going to be embedded investigations that students can do at any point in the school year. The points, they do it, they get points, those points then go on to their final exam, which is a big change, okay? They have to be completed in the same year as the assessment. That's kind of obvious, but I always say that so that we're clear. They would love pilot schools. So if you're working with a school, elementary or middle school, and you would like to pilot these performance embedded components, check that state ed website. And they're going to focus on performance expectations that aren't easily done in a test situation. So if you have to conduct an investigation, very hard to do exam day. But conducting an investigation is something I can do in my classroom quite easily. And that's what the goal of that is. The schools will get your packet of possible investigations, possible embedded tasks the beginning of the year. And all of these, as I said, are going to be designed by New York State teachers because we are still allowed to do that in New York State. And I think that is the end. That's all I've got. Any takeaways for science? Yes. We hear that often. As teaching pre-service teachers, that's one of our first conversations is how did you learn science? Paint a picture for your typical science classroom. And we're sitting at desks. They do something cool up front, and then we, read about what this thing was, or we watch a simulation about what this thing was. We do some more calculations usually, and then we go do the exact same thing in lab. And so that's a really interesting thing to begin to talk about because that's their expectation of a science classroom. And now we have to flip that for our pre-service teachers, because let's face it, as teachers, you kind of gravitate towards how you were taught in the beginning. Like that's your default. You had coaches, you just didn't call them that. You had, example teachers that you followed. And so shifting their mind to really deeply thinking about the practice of science education is 80% of a pre-service course, getting them to really think about what good science education is and why we would do it this way. So yeah, I wish my science teachers were like that too.
I think it's important, I know you guys aren't science people, but you're education people and you're in schools. Just ask the people around your school about what they're doing to get ready for the new science test. Because most likely they're not thinking about it right now, and there is a lot to think about. Maybe it's good they're not thinking about it right now, but at some point this year they have to start thinking about it.
It's a year and a half.
And we're here to help, but only if people come to workshops and come to mini courses and so forth.
I work in social studies, which shares a lot of access in a lot of ways, but I think right now in our schools where so how does all of this play out given that? What efforts are being for school, like from school to see the time? Something that social studies can run for you.
Put in assessments. That's
It helps.
when this 5th grade assessment shows up, I guarantee you that there's going to be quite a bit of science being taught.
But the sad thing is it'll be maybe 4th and 5th grade, which is too late. I mean, our new standards, the old standards, I would argue that we've done okay with limited teaching of science at the elementary level because it's so content based. We just pick up the slack and just keep going in middle school and high school and kind of fill in the pieces. The new standards are extremely foundational. And even because it's 3-dimensional, it's foundational of each practice, foundational thinking in the cross-cutting concepts and foundational content. And so not having that is going to put a very big burden on that 5th grade teacher. And getting the word out about that. You know, we'll do workshops for administrators just to highlight the shifts. Like when you're observing people, please don't ding them for not having the objective on the board. If I tell you our goal today is to learn about the north and south pole of a magnet, I've just destroyed the phenomenon, right? Allow them to have something a little bit. Today our objective is to explore
our phenomenon
of this. And you need to be okay with that. And here's why, because this is the shift of science. The kids are figuring it out. And if I tell them and put up an I can statement, I've killed the wonder on the phenomenon. So part of it is just educating administrators, but I think also doing things where this is the old question and we kind of muddled through and did okay. I want you to look at these new questions and what kids are going to be asked to do. If you don't give enough time for that to happen, it's not going to be magic, right? They're not magically going to do okay on your science assessments. So I think that you start at the top with administrators and also teachers, but I think you need to create a need.
I think, maybe I should stop recording here. I think, given the people sitting in this room, it'd be interesting to start a charter school where we only have science, social studies, and art scheduled and embed
ELA and math.
literacy and math.
Mhm.
Because I think it would be more effective, because you have the engagement of real life
Right.
in all three of those things.
And I mean, that's the message whenever I get a chance and somebody says, well, what can we be doing? I said, use science as your vehicle to teach ELA and math. Don't try to add science. Just don't do that.
And that doesn't mean reading a trade book.
Right.
At all. It means doing science, but writing about it and reading about it as needed because you need more information.
Yeah. But I can't guarantee that message is getting out. I mean, I think Dave's right. The assessment is part of it. That they'll be like, oh, this shock and awe when the assessment comes out. And part of me really hopes for that. I mean, that it is a shock and awe event, that it isn't, that our kids don't do really well on it. And I hope it's shock and awe all the way up. And that we keep it that way and not adjust and try to, play a numbers game. Really accurately assess what are we doing. Don't use it as a grade. Don't penalize the student, but start looking that this is a problem. We're not doing this well, and let's put some effort and money from state ed into getting this done correctly.